Hello and welcome to another video. Now, it's into the Christmas baking season, and in Germany that means one thing: Stollen. Stollen is an enriched dough filled with candied fruits and nuts, oftentimes soaked in brandy or rum. And the dish comes out of Dresden in various forms going way back, I think, to the 14th century. But in its modern form, it maybe goes back a few hundred years. The dish itself has gone through a number of transformations, partly for religious reasons and partly due to ingredients becoming available. But this is still one of the great Christmas contributions from Germany. So we're going to make it today. Now, like a lot of really great dishes, if you're not 100% prepared for it, even though it's a complicated dish, there are substitutions you can make. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them. There are some substitutions that I've made here, and those substitutions will affect the final product. But because Stollen is sort of a wide tradition, there are a number of things you can do with it. For example, instead of soaking the fruits in rum or brandy, I've decided to use Batavia arrack. Arrack is a rum-like drink from Indonesia, which is now produced exclusively for export mostly to Europe. But it is often used in baking and things like that. It has a wonderful additional flavor, especially when paired with fruits and so forth. And in fact, in some grocery stores you'll see arrack flavoring. But why would you use that if you can get the real thing? So I've decided to go ahead and add that this time. I've also added a little bit of candied lime peel to the lemon and orange peels. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. Unlike my other videos, I'm going to do this one very much by chapter. Within each chapter, we will cover the ingredients for that chapter. So we'll get started first with the fruit and nut mixture. Then we'll do the dough. And then, of course, you have the rising and baking process, which will be the next one, and finally the topping process. And then we age it for at least a week or two in order to let the flavors really kind of meld. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go ahead and discuss the ingredients next for the fruit and nut mixture. Now, for the ingredients here, for the fruit and nut mixture, I have some home candied citrus peels, and I'll probably do another video on that later because this is actually a really good thing to do. These have better flavor than anything you can buy at the store, and normally this would be maybe from 1 orange and 2 lemons, or 2 oranges and 2 lemons. I've cut it back a little bit. I've done 1 orange, 1 lemon, and 1 lime, just because that's what I had. And I'm going to substitute for some of the orange peel a little bit of extra orange zest as I cook. So that's one substitution you can do, but this is again, you know, my approach. Second thing is I have some chopped blanched almonds. Now, if you want to know how to blanch almonds, I cover that in the glug video from last year. I'll link to that in the comments. But that's that. And then I have about 200 grams of, that's like, what, about 6 or 7 ounces of grapes. Raisins. And then to that I have 80 milliliters of Batavia arrack. This definitely smells like Batavia arrack. And what we're going to do is we're going to mix these together and pour the arrack over the top and let it set aside while we go ahead and make our dough. So here we're going to start by dumping in the raisins. The candied citrus. And the almonds. Now, since I just barely blanched these almonds, they probably won't absorb much of the arrack. That's fine. And then let's just pour the arrack over the top. like that. Then we will stir it up and we'll periodically just mix it a little bit so that the arrack gets a chance to be absorbed as much as possible by all this fruit. You're going to see here, it just barely coated it. In fact, I might add another 20 milliliters or so just to give it a little more. Yeah, I'm going to add a little more. I'm actually adding 40 milliliters because why not? If I have a little extra, then I can go ahead and pour it off and maybe make a cocktail or something. Arrack, by the way, is great for cocktails. It's a little different. You can see though that even with this, there's not much pooling up in the bottom. So I'm not going to have to drain this very much. Anyway, I'll stir this occasionally, but next we'll go ahead and make our dough. So now onto the dough. We have 1/4 liter of milk. We have the zest of a lemon plus the zest of an orange. We have 100 grams of sugar. And out of this sugar, we're going to take something to put in the milk to get the yeast going. We have some spices. This is about ½ teaspoon or so of freshly ground cardamom. You could use maybe a 3/4 or 1 teaspoon if it's not freshly ground. I have about ½ teaspoon of cinnamon and a teaspoon of nutmeg. Some people prefer to use mace, but I couldn't even really make sense of the German translation for mace, so I think people here probably would use nutmeg. Then I have 600 grams of flour, to which I have added a teaspoon of salt. Finally, I have 4 eggs. I'm going to put in 1 whole and 3 yolks. Of course, then I have yeast. We'll talk about the yeast as we get this started. Next up, we do the milk. We're going to heat up the milk as an incubator for the yeast. Now here, I am going to heat up on medium heat the milk until it is just warm to the touch. To this, a lot of people add the zest directly to the dough, but I'm going to add it to the milk mixture just to give it a little bit of a head start on the flavors dispersing. And I'm going to do the same thing with my spices. So, in go the spices. And then 2 tablespoons of this out of the sugar. So just doesn't have to be very precise, so you don't have to use a formal measure, but we're now going to stir this and warm it up until it's just barely warm to the touch. This is smelling really, really good. So once this is warm, I will add the yeast, and 1 packet's probably enough. That's like 1 tablespoon. Some people like to add more. It doesn't really matter that much because yeast grows exponentially. And so, yeah, if it's an older batch of yeast, maybe you want to add more, but it's not that sensitive to the amount. So I'll be back as this starts to get just a little bit warm. So this is just starting to get warm to the touch, so I'm going to turn the heat off. And I am going to pour in 1 packet of yeast. Now, Nowadays, everybody uses active dry yeast here in Germany. But of course, before that, or if you're in some other parts of the world, like Sweden, you might have to use fresh yeast, and that really requires this process. With active dry yeast, you could probably add the yeast directly to the dough, or the flour mixture, and it would probably work. But fresh yeast really requires the starter process. So I'm going to go ahead and take it off the heat so it doesn't absorb too much more heat, and we're going to let this sit for about 10 minutes. So now we're ready to proceed. The milk mixture is starting to look pretty frothy. I'm going to add in the vicinity of 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. This looks like an oil extract, that's fine. Here in Germany, a lot of the extracts are oil-based because, well, oils facilitate flavor. That's fine. Vanilla oil will work. Next, I'm going to beat these eggs and mix them into the milk. I'm going to do that so that all my wet ingredients are together, along with the spices. So here now I have my wet ingredients, the spiced milk and yeast and eggs. And to this I'm going to start to add all my dry ingredients. Or I'm going to add my dry ingredients into a bowl and mix in the wet ingredients. The key thing here is that this is an enriched dough. I've used a bread flour here, which is usually what I use for enriched doughs. And some people say to add the butter at this stage. I don't. I add it once I kind of have the dough formed. I guess if you're using a dough hook, it might be a little different. So we're just going to basically stir this together. Add more. Stir this in. And note I'm using a spoon because that's a better approximation for dough hook than a fork, and a fork will be a lot more of a pain to clean. With a spoon, you basically have two curved but otherwise flat surfaces. With the fork, you have the spaces in between the tines. So next I'm going to mix all this together very well, and then I'm going to start to work in the butter. So first, some of you may have noticed I forgot to add the sugar in while I was stirring that in. I did add it. It is now well mixed into the bread. It is important to get the sugar all the way in before you run out of flour. But this is now all nicely kneaded together. And now it's time to start working in the butter. The reason I do it this way is usually with enriched doughs, I like to have what I call a semi-laminated dough. If I just stir in the butter right away, it really inhibits gluten formation, but that also inhibits allowing this to rise. Well, if I stir in the butter partway through, this will rise a lot more, and the butter will help it become a little bit flakier. So that's a really important note on all of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the butter. I'm just going to start working it in slabs. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slice. The butter should be pretty soft. It ought to be room temperature. I'm just going to put a slab of butter on the top, and I'm basically going to fold the dough around it, and I'm going to knead it a little bit, and then I'm going to work in the next one. And the dough will start to feel really greasy and buttery right away. That's because the butter's not fully integrating itself into the dough. That's why I call this a semi-laminated dough. For those of you who are pretty familiar with baking, you probably know that a laminated dough is where you would roll a dough around a really cold block of butter, fold it, and repeat. So I'm not going for the whole flaky bit, but this, as I say, in my experience, best balances gluten formation with having a nice buttery rich dough. So I'm going to continue working in all this butter and I'll be back. Now this is now the fully semi-laminated dough. You'll note it looks really, really buttery. And believe it or not, this was actually less butter than some of the base recipes I looked at recommended. So having the butter on the outside of the dough like this, or not fully integrated into the dough like this, helps allow the dough to rise. When we talk about enriched doughs like this, you have to remember that both the eggs, the milk, and the butter are all going to inhibit gluten formation. Gluten is, of course, what traps the air as the yeast expels carbon dioxide. If you don't have that gluten formation, things are going to stay very, very dense. So by doing it this way, we ought to get a much, much lighter product. I'm now going to set this in a warm water bath, not very hot, but just a bit warm, and let it go for an hour, hour and a half, until it doubles in size. Then we'll stir in our fruit and nut mixture. So for the fruit and nut mix, the important thing is we really don't want any of the liquid. So I'm going to pick it up with my hands. And I'm going to put the first few handfuls in without draining it, just because it's difficult to drain that last little bit. And if we get if with the semi-laminated doughs, if we get a little bit of liquid in, it's not the end of the world, but as we get closer, we will want to try to drain some of this liquid off. And you're going to note that liquid is very thick. It has absorbed a lot of the sugar from the candied fruit. But we really, really don't want that making the dough a lot stickier. There we go. And now we're going to knead all of this into the dough. And with these semi-laminated doughs, they're pretty soft and pliable. So you don't really need to knead it per se. You can just kind of grab it and pull it, and it's gonna incorporate everything. So here is, I'm just gonna now knead it a bit to get everything nice and even, and I'll be right back. So now for shaping the dough, and normally this would be used to make two. So I'm actually going to make a third one that's a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to grab, for the third small one, I'm going to grab about a nice handful of dough, and I'm going to place it here and place it in an oval about an inch thick. Then we are going to roll it over the marzipan, and then basically this will then go on the baking sheet. And I have one small one here that I'll use as a taste test. For the other ones, we will make them the same way. So generously flour the board with these sorts of doughs, and take half of the rest of it, and I'll do the same thing. Once I have it pressed out in an oval, I'll be right back. So here we have the first big oval. I have my marzipan rolled out, so it's just about the width of the oval. We're going to roll it around and make sure it's sealed in the middle. The marzipan can be omitted if you want. And then this will go on the baking sheet. So. Then I'll do the same thing with the other one and then I'll be back. So here we have a small Stollen for the taste test and 2 larger ones. We will let these rise for about another 40 minutes and then we'll put them in the oven. They will, they'll cook at 350 Fahrenheit, that's like 175 Celsius, for about 30 or 40 minutes and then they'll be out. So just excited to see these come along, and we'll be back soon. So now it's been about 40 minutes and these are just starting to become a bit puffy, so they're going to go into the oven. I did tent them under plastic wrap before, and once they come out then we'll powder them with sugar after brushing them with butter, and then we'll wrap these two to ripen them up, but we'll use this one for the taste test. So now these have been in the oven for about half an hour. They're just starting to brown on the top, which is just what I want. Next I'm going to brush them with butter and top them with powdered sugar. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Now for dusting this with the powdered sugar, easiest thing to do is to take a wire sieve and just, you dump this over the top and then shake. And with Stollen, we will also make sure that we rub this into the crevices and on the sides. Okay, same thing on the smaller one that I will use as a taste test. And then on this other large one too. Using a sieve like this, although it's also helpful for much smaller amounts of powdered sugar, what it really does is it allows us to get a nice even coating. And now we will go ahead and let this cool down completely. And now for the taste test. So normally you don't eat Stollen right out of the oven. It's really good to let the flavors permeate a little more. This being said, this is actually very nice. The citrus elements, the raisins, all of that comes through very nicely. I'm very sure that after I wrap this up and let it sit for a couple of weeks, it'll be even better. So, thank you all for watching. Hope you have a great day. Dankeschön, vielen Dank, and see you next week.